Thank you. What a nice group. I see some friendly faces. That's always good. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to have been introduced by Abby, one of my students from Ole Miss. We were just reminiscing 2 years ago about this time. She was finishing her seminar on creativity in the South that I was teaching, and glad to have her in class and to follow her work here. She gave us a kind of update on all the good things she's been doing. So it's very special to have her introducing me. I also want to acknowledge Jimmy Thomas. Raise your hand, Jimmy. Jimmy and I drove over this morning. You thankfully got all that bad weather out of Arkansas before we drove this morning. A beautiful day to be on the road from Oxford. Jimmy deserves a lot of the credit for the new Encyclopedia of Southern Culture that Abby mentioned. I was the editor-in-chief, but he was the managing editor who actually got everything done. So we always have worked well together, and I appreciate his being here, and I hope you get a chance to meet him also and talk with him. So I'm going to talk about the new Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, talk about the South's past, talk about the South's future also today, and how people have in different times in history kind of imagined the South's future. I realize we have a limited amount of time. I always think about that when I think about one of the favorite things I did when I was director of our Southern Studies Center. I got to make B.B. King an honorary Southern Studies professor. Now, B.B. was doing a concert for Living Blues magazine that our center publishes, and so we thought it would be a good idea to acknowledge, him and his importance. And so we came up with the idea of making him an honorary Southern Studies professor. So we had a plaque made up, Chancellor signed it, we had a nice news conference, and people asked him questions. He was going on a little too long with one of the answers, and he kind of caught himself and said, "Sorry, I went on a little too long, but then again, I am a professor." So I am a professor, but I'll try not to go too long today. But the title of my talk is The 21st Century South, and it's about the new Encyclopedia of Southern Culture and the burden of the South's future. In 1960, esteemed historian C. Vann Woodward published an important volume of essays called The Burden of Southern History, exploring the Southern regional identity, arguing that the historical experience of the people of the South was the only basis for a continuing regional distinctiveness. With the dramatic changes of the civil rights movement only a few years away, Woodward seemed to be looking to the past to point the region toward a resource as it negotiated what he saw as future social change. It was not only changes in race relations, but changes in the economy that would challenge the future South of his time. He wrote, "The symbol of innovation is inescapable," identifying the bulldozer as a new Southern symbol of change in 1960. "The roar and groan and dust of it greet one on the outskirts of every Southern city," he wrote. "The Bulldozer Revolution," he called it, "demolishes the old to make way for the new." The machine symbolized the revolution in several ways. In its favorite area of operation, the area where city meets country, in its relentless speed, in its supreme disregard for obstacles, in what it demolishes and in what it builds. Looking back on it now, from our perspective, Woodward was undoubtedly correct that the Bulldozer Revolution changed the South. But it seems a dated symbol now in an era when the major form of innovation is not a machine that roars and groans and dusts it up, but a computer, or, to be more 21st century, an iPad that connects the user quietly to a World Wide Web. In any event, in his essay, The Search for Southern Identity, Woodward proposed history as the basis for a mid-20th century Southern identity, seen in the South's legacy of poverty, of defeat and failure in the Civil War, the moral guilt over slavery and racial segregation in a nation dedicated to the creed that all people are created equal, and a sense of place in a nation swirling about seemingly in constant movement. All of these experiences, C. Vann Woodward said, represented a burden of Southern history. The tendency to think about the South's future is a long one. One could surely go back to the beginning of the Civil War, with white Confederates and African-American slaves sharing in different ways a hopeful optimism of coming change in the future, whether a future of independence and self-determination for white Southerners in the Confederacy, or a future of freedom from slavery and new self-determination for slaves. Consider the words of Robert Barnwell Rhett when South Carolina seceded. It seems especially ironic and appropriate today that this fire-eating Southern patriot, Robert Barnwell Rhett, was in 1861 picturing the historian in the year 2000 writing this passage about what he saw as the bold dreams of the antebellum South. Quote, "And extending their empire across this continent to the Pacific and down through Mexico to the other side of the Great Gulf and over the isles of the sea, Confederates will establish an empire and a civilization which has never been equaled or surpassed, a civilization teeming with orators, poets, philosophers, statesmen, and historians equal to those of Greece and Rome, and presented to the world the glorious spectacle of a free, prosperous, and illustrious people." One can only kind of stand in awe at the delusion of the passage and its confident vision of a Southern-driven Greek democracy for the Western Hemisphere. By the end of the war, though, white and black Southerners had different readings of the future. The defeated Confederates saw an apocalyptic future, fearing their social death, while African Americans faced Reconstruction with the hopefulness of achieving the full meaning of freedom. By the turn of the 20th century, white Southerners had recovered their optimism and looked confidently toward a future within a United States that now accepted their hegemony over Southern racial matters. A 12-volume series of books called The South in the Building of the Nation appeared in 1909, about a century ago, and the writer saw the South's future as a productive one within the nation. Scholar William Trent wrote the introduction to the volume on the South's intellectual life, and he predicted the advantage the South's classical tradition, he said, ought to give its writers, and to express the hope that when some future generation undertakes in a work like the present to survey the achievements of the section, the volumes devoted to literature will register a progress commensurate with all reasonable wishes and expectations. Of course, we hardly talk today about the South's classical tradition as a defining feature of the South the way that he was doing a century ago. We can say that our literature volume in the new Encyclopedia of Southern Culture surely does register a progress commensurate with all reasonable wishes and expectations, to quote his Victorian-era language, but it was the convulsion of early 20th century modernist thought and social change that brought the Southern literary renaissance, thus the dangers of prediction of the future. Meanwhile, around the same time Trent was writing, black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois was meditating on the souls of black folk and making his own prediction that the problem of the 20th century would be the color line, a prediction more accurate than that of either Robert Barnwell Rhett or William Trent. The Great Depression brought a crisis to American culture, including the South, and it led to more ponderings of the region's future in the interwar years. In 1931, historian Howard Mumford Jones wrote an essay entitled "The Future of Southern Culture." He summarized Southern culture at that point in 1931 this way: "Thus a region organized around an agrarian economy and characterized by cultural diversity, by kindliness, by a personalized relationship among individuals, by an interest in living for its own sake, and by an easygoing make-do philosophy, having survived the Civil War and Reconstruction, now finds in the 20th century confronted by a new cultural problem, the problem of industrialization." Jones predicted that the diversities of culture which have hitherto characterized this vast region are now threatened by a mechanized civilization in standard parts. Still, he had faith in what he called the Young South, working toward the creation and development of better commonwealths on a program of a balanced agrarian and industrial life, determined by the needs of the state and not merely by the national patterns of a machine civilization. Jones's vision of the Southern future came partly out of two main intellectual trends of the 1930s South. That of the Vanderbilt agrarians, a group of writers at Vanderbilt University who wrote a 1930 book called "I'll Take My Stand," defending the South as the home of agrarian values. But the other main intellectual trend that went into people thinking about the future was that of the social scientists, led by North Carolina sociologist Howard Odum, who saw the need for regional planning for a balance between agrarian and industrial development and values for the Southern future. A few years later, in 1939, Louisiana writer Hamilton Basso wrote an essay called "The Future of the South." Once I started thinking about this topic of people, there's a history of the thinking about the South's future. And I found all sorts of essays that have been done on this going back 100 years. Anyway, in 1939, Hamilton Basso wrote "The Future of the South for the New Republic." He posited that it is a state of mind, rather than any oneness born of regionalism, that makes the South. He gave his view of how that state of mind developed. In the years immediately following the Civil War, he wrote, it was principally determined by hatred. Hatred in the South yielded to bitterness, a bitterness that caused the former leaders of the South to retreat into a dim half-world of memory and remorse. And after bitterness came distrust. Distrust is slowly passing, for more and more the realization is being forced upon us that we are not opposed to the United States, we are a part of the United States. But some of the old bitterness yet remains. Forget this state of mind, he warned. Dwell only on the bleached bones of charts and indices, and you forget the living temper of the people, a temper that will help shape the future as it helped shape the past. The indices and charts refer to the work of Howard Odum, whose book Southern Regionalism in the 1930s had 700 charts and maps indicating the dreadful, deep-rooted social economic problems facing the region. Basso echoed Odum's call for planning to address systematically and rationally these problems. Basso wrote that it is from this threshold of awareness of these problems that we face the future. The future of the South obviously cannot be disassociated from the future of the nation. The older pattern of Southern life, in any event, he wrote, had been shattered beyond recognition by the forces of history. That phrase, forces of history, seems to presage Woodward's burden of the Southern past. Southerners must understand, according to Basso, that they can not assume their earlier tradition to be living invalid when the region's leaders now, meaning the 1930s, quote, are newly rich people whose fortunes have been sucked up from the oil wells of Coca-Cola. I don't even know what that means, but it sounds good. It sounds good. So in the end, Basso's prediction for the Southern future was, as he wrote, a few nightmares as well as dreams. But we may validly hope in the nation and in the South that there will be recorded such compelling dreams as men have recorded in the past, those inner visions which through the alchemy of art and artist have become the living dream of humankind. Flash forward now to the early 1970s, and we find a biracial group of progressive Southerners, members of the LQC Lamar Society, who saw their moment in time, namely the early post-Jim Crow years, as ripe with possibilities for the future. Writers, journalists, politicians, policymakers, they saw the future of the South as one of planned progress. The South's late economic development, historical legacy of defeat in the Civil War and questioning of nationalistic presumptions, and the South's tortured but seemingly now redeemed race relations would position the South, they hope, to lead the nation more broadly in the future. They drew from Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech with its imagining in 1963 of a redeemed South, where black children and white would walk together and sit down at the table of brotherhood. Writer Willie Morris's introduction to the symposium they published called, I love this title, You Can't Eat Magnolias. Willie Morris explained that the unifying theme which undergirds this varied collection is that out of a meaningful working partnership between whites and blacks, the South stands an exceptionally good chance of solving its old egregious faults and its more contemporary ones, while both preserving the best in its own unique heritage and offering more than a few crucial lessons to other Americans. The volume had a whole section of essays entitled The South's Future, and the title of North Carolina Governor Terry Sanford's essay told it best, The End of Myths, the South Can Lead the Nations. By getting away from the Southern legend of Old South romanticism, Confederate piety, and racial intolerance, the South could lead the nations. Notice he says nations plural. Very hopeful message that the LQC Lamar Society offered in the 1970s. Well, if those moments in time I have reviewed produce speculations on the future of the South, it seems we live in another such age. The new Encyclopedia of Southern Culture has appeared in the early 21st century and surely reflects the era it is in. We like to think that scholarship, and especially reference works, are timeless, but though we strive for accuracy, authority, and comprehensiveness, encyclopedias come out of the intellectual and other concerns of the times when they are researched and written. Planning for the new encyclopedia began at the turn of the 21st century, and so we can claim to be a millennial, as they call the generation coming of age now. I have been reflecting on our volumes in terms of their relationship to the 21st century, and I want to share some of my thoughts with you. Of course, the encyclopedia was not planned as an interpretation or argument about the 21st century. Still, in considering a new edition of that original encyclopedia from the 1980s, one of our guiding principles was to search for new material that reflected scholarly and cultural concerns of the contemporary period. Perhaps the most important theme in the encyclopedia relating to the 21st century is that of globalization. That topic is considered at numerous points across the volumes from the viewpoint of history, the economy, literature, and other forms of culture. As James Peacock and Carrie Matthews write in one article, globalization is the integration of the world, economically, politically, and culturally. Globalization has local impacts in each of these areas. It creates diversity as people, goods, and ideas migrate from one place to another. Globalization is not just capitalism, booming when the economy booms, disappearing when it falters, as in recent times. It is also an attitude. Recent data suggests that Southerners tend toward a global attitude, but Southern and globalism are not tangible, absolute conditions, but tendencies. Southernism is defined culturally, historically, economically, psychologically, and geographically as a concern and identification with the South. Globalism is a concern and identity with the wider world. The two concerns and identities can clash, but also overlap and interweave. A 2002 Southern Focus poll at the University of North Carolina suggests that some Southerners see themselves as both different from non-Southerners and connected to the world as a whole. When asked whether they see themselves primarily as different from non-Southerners or linked to people around the world, nearly 50% of Southerners responded that they felt connected to people around the world. This identification by Southern respondents with the world was surprising to me at the time, but suggests the recognition of the dynamism and the reality of international connections between Southern communities and the world. The peculiar positioning of the South in the global world is significant. As the scholars Peacock and Matthews note, the South is a distinctive player within the American role of global leader. The South has a special connection to the Third World, for the South itself was, and in some parts still is, a Third World nation. Studies show how the South, as a plantation society in the past, displayed strong similarity to other plantation societies around the world. The South is a unique overlap of a white majority and a plantation society. The South can be seen as the northernmost extension of the plantation system of South America and the Caribbean, and the southernmost extension at the same time of a dominant northern European culture. The South is surely one example of a more general pattern of a plantation-based society with a colonial background. My favorite example of this occurred during Bill Clinton's presidency. I'm glad I could come up with this. Clinton went to a meeting in Latin America, and one of the people on the program there was Nobel Prize winning writer Gabriel Marquez. He called Clinton a part of a region that extended from Arkansas down to Marquez's Colombia. Clinton sat there for a minute and nodded in agreement, affirming his Caribbean identity. But the story is more complicated than that. The South also has many what we might call first world or North features, meaning the kind of power associated with European and North American culture. The Bank of America is the nation's second largest bank. Charlotte, its corporate home, ranked second after New York in banking assets. When you consider the economic output in the southern states, the 11 former Confederate states alone, the South represents the fourth largest economy in the world. Southern products and services flow around the world. Coca-Cola, cigarettes, CNN, Delta, on and on. There are these global international corporations that are centered in the South. Peacock and Matthews' article on globalization in our encyclopedia is intriguing because it focuses not only on such tangible things as we've mentioned, but also on values. Certain experiences and values define the South as potentially a mediating force between the United States and much of the world, especially other Souths, whether South Asia, South Africa, South America. Blues and bluegrass music, Cajun New Orleans dishes, grits and cornbread are identified as Southern, and yet often these are known and appreciated around the world. The authors of one of our globalization articles argue that the lessons of life that the South can convey derive from its burden of history, going back to Woodward's article, including not only of defeat in war and the experience of being colonized, but also internal problems, racial problems, oppression of poor whites, Native Americans. All of these experiences are experiences that are not uncommon to other societies around the world. Think of all the European countries that face defeat in centuries of warfare. The South embodies values of traditions of kinship, family, community, and the valuing of a sense of place. These experiences and qualities are distinctive, yet similar also to those of other Souths around the world. The 21st century South will be one dominated by various forms of multimedia, and our media volume in the new encyclopedia engages those for us. Film, television, and photography have long provided compelling images and stories about the South, but they're often marred by stereotype representations. One of our articles on television series about the South analyzes recent shows such as True Blood. Has anybody seen True Blood? No, True Blood? Yes. It's set in the deep south of Louisiana, and it harnesses old images of violence and sensuality that have been put on the South, but doing so now by exploiting the popular fascination in the 21st century with vampire tales, each episode containing graphic sex and blood. True Blood may also be read as exploring civil rights themes, with vampires symbolically playing the part of minorities in a community suffering discrimination. One critic has described the series as The Addams Family meets the Dukes of Hazzard as written by Anne Rice. Cable TV series show all sorts of Southern representations. There are shows on swamp people, Great Gator people, redneck people, hillbilly people, drawn with very broad brush, even more noteworthy because so many of them appear to be reality shows. At least many such contemporary representations of the South in the media are played for laughs. The character of Kenneth Parcell, the intensely moral goofball who is the NBC page in the comedy series 30 Rock, he's from North Georgia, kind of a mountain area. He certainly stereotypes, that character on 30 Rock, stereotypes the white Southerner, but this guy is a lovable and simple Southerner, an old type, think Gomer Pyle. When asked what he finds funny, he answers, oh, the usual, I suppose, two hobos sharing a bean, lady airline pilots. Even more revealing of the media and the South in the 21st century is our article on Internet representations of the South. Cyberspace was hailed early on as a monolithic technology that, because of its rapid communication capabilities, would eliminate the need for traditional geographical and cultural distinctions, such as those of Southern culture. In reality, many information superhighways exist in the World Wide Web, and they run through and connect a multitude of different communities of expression, including Southern expression. The very names attached to internet sites reflect how people incorporate attachments to the South into their online identity. Just doing a search recently, I found www.southerner.org, www.dixieweb.com. Rather than signaling the end of the importance of regions, the Internet and its many components, including web pages, listservs, chat rooms, blogs, and the social networking sites, have ushered in a new platform for representing, talking about, and even debating the South. As our article notes, these online representations together constitute a virtual South, a new laboratory for studying the continuing importance of the region within popular culture and the evolving nature of what it means to be Southern in the 21st century, within a global economy and society. Again, many of the representations of the South on the Internet involve humor, and much of this humor represents Southerners as simple, unsophisticated, backwoods characters, continuing a tradition that dates back to the region's frontier era in the early 19th century. Internet humorists are fond of exaggerating the distinctiveness of Southern speech, for example, and have published an online hicophonics to English dictionary to assist us in translating boss to boss, tire to tire, and barbed wire to barbed wire. For other Internet humorists, the focus is not on reproducing the stereotypical dialects of the region, but in defining the general content within conversations. The top 40 things you would never hear a Southerner say is a narrative frequently found on the Internet. Supposedly, Southerners, for example, never say, I'll take Shakespeare for $1,000, Alex. They would never say, wrestling's fake, or unsweetened tea tastes better. As access to Internet technology broadens geographically and socially, the virtual South is increasingly a foundation for the expression of identity. A Google search reveals that phrases such as I am a Southerner or I am from the South appear frequently in cyberspace. For some Internet users, representing the South in fond and personal ways comes in response to moving away from the region. An interesting example of this is the Southern Gal Goes North blog, in which an Alabama-raised wine consultant now living in Chicago archives her region-based memories and writings. Part of the cultural power of these online regional representations comes not only from their content, but also from their inclusion of hyperlinks to other like-minded people and organizations. The proliferation and consumer use of hyperlinks in turn creates what appears to be a cyber-Southern community. Well, let's look for a minute at two volumes of the new Encyclopedia of Southern Culture. The first volume on religion, and the last volume that was just published, volume 24, on race, in terms of material suggestive of our theme of the 21st century South. Well, religion has surely been one of the most enduring cultural forces in the South. The dominance of evangelical Protestant groups in the South dates to the early 19th century, and if someone had been pondering 200 years ago in 1814 the future of the 19th century South, they would have been wise to see the spread of Baptist and Methodist to overwhelming religious hegemony by the time of the Civil War. Their numbers grew even larger after the war as religious affiliation became a kind of badge of Southern cultural identity. The period after World War II witnessed enormous social, economic, and political changes as one regional landmark after another vanished. But the dominance of evangelical churches remained, tying the late 20th century culture to the old-time religion. Surely the South remained the Bible Belt, even in the changing South. This evidence of the continued vitality of traditional religion must be seen, though, in light of a changing Southern context. Prosperity, secularization, the role of the media and technology, all are broad forces that are obstacles, and many times, to the maintenance of traditional Southern ways in the 21st century South in general, and especially so in terms of religion. These supposedly, forces like prosperity, secularization, role of media and technology, supposedly contribute to the declining significance of religion in cultures anywhere, but this has not been the case in the South. From our article called Growth and Diversity in the Urban South, one of our encyclopedia articles writes, in recent years, the growth of suburbs and exurbs has contributed to the phenomenal increase of megachurches, which may be seen as a particular 21st century form of Southern religiosity. Some of these congregations occupy former sports arenas. Others build new campuses or expand old ones. They offer coffee shops, sports activities, and musical concerts for the 2,000 or more people who attend weekly services. Megachurches are not exclusively Southern, but it is estimated that half of all megachurches in the United States are located in Southern metropolitan areas. The coming of new peoples and religions has brought new challenges to evangelical Protestants in the South in the 21st century. Perhaps the most important statistic one might remember, reflecting the specifically religious impact of this immigration, is that over 20% of Southerners are now affiliated with a non-Protestant faith, whether Catholicism, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, or another faith. Of course, we need to continue remembering there are still more Baptists than people in the South. But it is striking that Buddhism may be growing at a more rapid rate than the Southern Baptist Convention. Indians from Southeast Asia alone have included Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. Most of the immigrants from Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim are Buddhist. Recent estimates are that 26% of American Muslims live in the South. Special attention should be given to Latino immigration to the region. Recent immigration to the Deep South and Atlantic Coast South has augmented traditional Latino populations in Texas and Florida. The Catholic bishops of the South have faced tremendous challenges in supplying resources, whether Spanish-speaking priests, larger facilities and churches, or social services that immigrants often go to Catholic churches seeking. The ever-proselytizing Baptists have opened productive new evangelical work among Latinos, and the Pentecostals have been even more successful, building on their long work in Latin America. These changes in the 21st century are reflected in a changing landscape. To be sure, evangelical Protestantism continues to mark the landscape, whether with the once pervasive white clapboard churches in the countryside or more substantial brick buildings in cities. 3 crosses evoking the crucifixion are scattered across the southern roadside often, and small poignant roadside crosses mark automobile deaths in many southern states, a particular evangelical way to remind whoever sees them of the need to get right with God. Indeed, roadside signs say, "Get right with God, Jesus saves, prepare to meet thy God." I saw one on I-55 in Mississippi recently. It was "Prepare to meet thy God," printed sign, but somebody hand-lettered underneath, "Last chance." You can still find in the South one of the traditional kind of material culture aspects of Southern religion, which are church fans. So I collect church fans, so I thought I'd bring a few of them here for you to see today. These were Southern air conditioning before there was air conditioning. So the original one, of course, was the palm fan. This is from the Klingner Funeral Home, licensed lady embalmer. These were usually very peaceful scenes. This is a fall church with the leaves changing color and a little pond. These were, beginning in the early 20th century, printing companies began to figure out the lithography and the reproduction so they could reproduce these on these cardboard fans with the sticks. Printing companies would could produce these in very large bulks, like 500 or 1,000, very, very inexpensively. And so businesses would buy them to advertise their company. And the main ones that bought them were funeral homes. So along with the Bible and the songbook, on Sunday morning in the pew, there would be the church fan, this one. Imagine, my idea is that the southern image of heaven are the scenes on these churches. Imagine you're in a hot Arkansas church. Surely heaven is this cool mountain scene. Mostly these are religious scenes. This is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus with the lambs. The most famous reproduction on the fans is, of course, the Last Supper. The Bible was the very important force, so when you have a fan, you put the Bible on it. Now, as I said, these were bought by businesses, and it didn't have to be a funeral home. Any business could buy it. Sometimes what's on the front doesn't go very well with what's on the back. This is a very sacred scene, but on the back it says, "Stop, rest, eat, and sleep at Howard's Snack Bar and Motel." This was very, very much a biracial tradition. We were all fight the heat. Little girls, very typical image here. On the back of this one, it says, "Keishan Funeral Home, Air-Conditioned Ambulance, Helena, Arkansas." Many of the images on mass-produced items in the early 20th century South were very demeaning to African Americans. But these images, of course, went in African American churches, and so they have very, very positive images, such as this one of a mother and a little boy. He's got a baseball bat. She's pouring milk. Those are very typical scenes for fans in black churches. I found this on eBay of Booker T. Washington reading his Bible. Dr. King was a very, very typical image in black churches. In the course of the 20th century, these fans moved out of Protestant tradition even. Again, the reason for them is the heat. I had a friend who went to the dedication of the Memphis Jewish home, an outdoor ceremony in June, and so they had to have a fan, the Memphis Jewish home. Of course, in the 20th century, they left the church altogether and became associated with recreational activities, from a watermelon festival I went to, Little League Baseball, and are you a tomato fan? If you go to the Mississippi Delta, tourism has Highway 61. We put our celebrities on our fans. Here's Minnie Pearl. It says howdy on the back. Scarlett O'Hara on a stick. And I couldn't talk about the South without talking about Elvis. Elvis, on the back it says Elvis fan. But the religion volume reminds us that these such traditional items as these and the signs on the landscape, they're joined by newer symbols reflecting the hard-to-miss presence of new faiths. Our Lady of Guadalupe is now displayed on candles bought in general grocery stores, on the back windows of pickup trucks, and other venues of public display. As our editor for the religion volume, Sam Hill, writes, "We note the Hindu temples, Buddhist centers, and Muslim mosques that have become a feature of the landscape. Large cities may contain several of these non-traditional religious houses. Meditation centers and retreat houses have sprung up here and there, sometimes holding attraction for Christians who are drawn to meditative practices. The once religiously homogeneous South is less and less that way, notwithstanding the staying and adaptive power of evangelical Protestantism. Demographically and culturally," he writes, "the American South grows steadily more like the rest of the nation in its interaction with global civilization." So Hill closes his overview essay with that passage, and it's particularly striking in its reference to global civilization. Remember Senator Rhett's Civil War praise of his imagined future South. A little could he have imagined the South adapting to the global civilization of the 21st century. So that was the first volume, and it tells us something about the changing South in religion. The last volume published, as I mentioned, was on race. This is the volume cover. Says more about that in a second. So editors for this volume commissioned new entries to reflect the race volume's concern with the South as a multiracial society. The origin of this volume, that's called Race, was the original section of the Encyclopedia of Southern Culture that was called Black Life in 1989 when the original encyclopedia was published. That focused on African American history and culture within a primarily biracial context. Since then, scholars have produced an exciting new literature that positions the South as a society that tried to impose rigid racial boundaries, but one that transcended those attempts, resulting in a dynamic, diverse, and fluid society. All the authors of these entries in this volume take as a given that race is a socially constructed category, and they go on to examine ideas about racial differences within a multiracial context, providing new ways of looking at the South's racial past and future. Racial diversity is the theme. Articles in the race volume focus on Asian American narratives between black and white. That's the title of one article, in which we learned that the earliest Asians to play a role in American life were not, as one might expect, on the West Coast, but rather as agricultural workers in colonial Louisiana in the 1700s. There are articles on the Atlantic world and the Pacific world, again, this broad connection that the South has had with economies and peoples from around the world. There is an article entitled Asians, Mexicans, Interracialism, and Racial Ambiguities, the title alone of which suggests the broader point that race in the South is a complicated phenomenon. Whether by disguise or misrecognition, therefore, a race has been repeatedly revealed as ambiguous, with uncertain boundaries, constructed and reconstructed within the borderlands and contested spaces produced by the South's social historical transformation. Perversely, perhaps, the very ambiguity of race may be a source of its enduring power for both those who impose and those who accept any given racial identity. Similarly, the blurring of the South's geographic and demographic boundaries may mirror the blurring of its cultural origins. The South's music, its cuisine, its architecture, all betray these diverse elements. All are deposits. They're like layers of a very complex history. All this makes for a rich and complex past and future. When we were picking an image for this race volume, the last one, we considered many options, many of which were based in the past in terms of images of rural poverty, of racial violence, perhaps. But we chose this contemporary image. This is a scene that has a mixed race group of social activists. The sign that one of them is carrying says, United for Voting Rights and Immigration Rights. So very contemporary, complex, ethnic, multi-ethnic Southern society. But the place of the activism, the protest, is the Selma Bridge that is just loaded with historical and cultural meaning for issues of race relations. In considering in the new Encyclopedia of Southern Culture's picture of the 21st century, we have heard some today about the burdens of the future based on the past, but that past has its limitations in thinking of the future. Many of the forces of globalization, for example, do not touch earlier views of the South's burdens. What does defeat of the Confederacy mean, for example, for international executives doing business in the South, or for their Latino workers doing the heavy lifting? Issues of race and skin color may seem less important to the latter than issues of immigrant rights and labor opportunities. Globalization, in its sunnier version, promises liberation from past imprisonments of place and an expansive economic future, but there are dark spots in the global South. Articles in the new Encyclopedia of Southern Culture explore this dark side of globalization's exploitation of workers, whether the traditional Southern working class of whites and African Americans, or of immigrant people who come seeking opportunity in the South. The South's traditional hierarchical society makes labor organizing more difficult, perhaps, than in other parts of the country, and the region's notoriously parsimonious attitude towards social services continues. Although the South overall has been a boom economy before the recent recession, at least, the South has the nation's highest rate still of rural poverty, a holdover from the past, and many health problems exist in the South that will be burdens for the South's future. In closing, I'm drawn to the wisest remarks I know about the South by an African-American writer, Albert Murray, one of my favorites, whose 1970s memoir, South to an Old Place, was part of that decade's hopeful post-segregation take on the South's future. In a 1976 Time magazine special issue on the South when Jimmy Carter was elected president, Albert Murray wrote of the tentativeness of predictions about the South's future. These things always go up and down, he wrote. As a Southerner, my main response is through the blues. The nature of the blues is improvisation. You must be ready for all eventualities. Amen.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was great. Most people probably know that the grandson of John Senior Rockefeller came to Arkansas in 1953, made a huge impact on the state, became governor from 1967 to 1971. Is there any discussion, talk, sentiment of how his actions spilled into the rest of the South, his impact on how things might have spurred in terms of advancement?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The question is about Governor Rockefeller, Winthrop Rockefeller, coming to the South and his role. Well, it was, that period in which he came was such a transformative period in the South in terms of economic changes, social changes, cultural development, greater nationalization. His coming here is a good example of that, and it's an example of all of that. So, and of the changing of the Republican Party, of course, in the South also, which had been traditionally the party of African Americans after the Civil War, the party of Lincoln and the freeing of the slaves, the Democratic Party, the party of white Southerners, the party of your grandfather, as they always said. So his coming was upsetting to many of much of the conventional wisdom about the South, I think. The fact that he had the resources that he did, and the fact that he worked to position Arkansas as a leader in all of those kind of changes, I think the importance is that moment in time in which he was doing all of this. Yes?
Yes, sir.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for being here. My name is Ramirez Beto. I'm a Clinton School student, Class 9. I have two questions. My first question dealing with Arkansas, Governor Sid McMath was really, I think, the first governor that really tried to get Arkansas to heal from the effects of Reconstruction. And every governor since Governor McMath has kind of worked off that platform. So how does Arkansas or any state in the South heal from the effects of Reconstruction that we're still dealing with? And my second question is about new southern cities, like a couple of cities where I'm in my area, like Hope and Texarkana, where you can't really divide the city along racial bounds anymore because it's so racially diverse. How do we get to more cities that look like that and start racial healing dialogue?
I think that's what you, as a Clinton School graduate, need to do. So, good questions. One is about Sid McMath as the pioneer of attempts to lead the South beyond older patterns of race relations and economics, all of this. I wish I knew the answer to that. That's a big question, a big question. And progressive leadership in the South has been so important in the steps that we make toward that. We know the South is still behind on so many social indices, and the gaps. And I'm in Mississippi, where we're at the very bottom on so many of these. So it's easy to get very discouraged about how we don't go far enough from that kind of Reconstruction era legacy and racial fears and distrust and divisions and all of those kind of things. And but measurably, the South is so much better than we were 50 years ago in all those kind of indices. The progress that has been made is extraordinary when you step back and kind of get some perspective on it, I think. So people like McMath and the governor since then, they're incremental steps, I think. They're incremental steps. And as long as you have a sense of that there's progress, the discouraging thing is after the recent recession, whenever economics is so important to all of these kind of social advances, I think, that you have a sense of you don't have that kind of coming together as much as needs to happen, But again, I think progressive leadership is often the key. I mean, I look at our state of Mississippi. Governor William Winter was this extraordinary figure from this 1970s period that I talked about. That was a very hopeful time. That was the period that produced all of these reformist governors in the South, including Bill Clinton. But Reuben Askew in Florida, John West in South Carolina, all across the South this was happening. And there were so many advances in the South in terms of getting beyond the kind of racial divisions and hierarchical divisions of social class and and all these other things. But I think it's progressive leadership and this kind of vision for the future that you can help persuade people who economically, part of what I didn't mention about globalization that I think affects the South is the fear that we're going to miss out on global developments. Now, if you have if in Mississippi we have a Nissan automobile factory and a Toyota factory, if you have a job there, then you're not worried you're missing out on globalization and its benefits. But for a lot of people, they don't have those jobs, and jobs are hard to find, and they see jobs fleeing to other countries. You see the textile mill industry of South Carolina shutting down totally because all the jobs went first to Mexico and then to China. So there's this fear out there among many Southerners, I think working class Southerners, that you're going to lose out from globalization. So you have to be able to come up with programs and a vision, really, of the future, that these are opportunities that exist in this interconnected world that we have. And it doesn't have to just be the kind of fearfulness of fear of what the North is doing, or fear even of what the future may, I'm an optimist, so I see the future of the South as a very good future, but I think that key is progressive leadership.
Professor Wilson, thank you so much for coming down and making that trip. James, thank you for your help. We appreciate you coming out, and we'll see you at the next one.